Atamari kia koutou, tuatahi ki oku hoa, I ronga I te tepu teitei, Moana, Claire, rātou ko Kawan, he mihi mahana kia koutou. Kia koutou katoa, ko hui hui mai nei I tēnei rā, tēnā koutou katoa. He uri no raukawa rā ko te whānau apanui ahau, ko Ngāti Āhuru tōku hapu, ko Hautere tōku maunga, ko Oraka tōku awa, kei Ngātira tōku tūranga waiwai, ko Te Tikanga tōku marae, ko Tracey Whare tōku ingoa. My presentation today will provide a brief review of how the UN system has responded to the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In my view, the UN has been able to do this in two ways. First, by way of substance, in relation to how UN fora recognise and provide for Indigenous peoples' rights in relation to their own mandates. And secondly, in relation to process, that is, how the Declaration and its normative framework have influenced the practices of UN fora. The Declaration has clearly influenced the substantive content of specific UN fora, and I will explain this further in my presentation. But perhaps what is less appreciated is the influence the Declaration has had in relation to process. Process, in my view, is important for two reasons. First, it is legally important because the practices that are adopted within the UN are of themselves a realisation of international law. For example, when Indigenous peoples participate in those fora and those fora make decisions. Secondly, it is politically important because such practices provide examples that can be applied in other UN fora and can also encourage a change in practice at the regional and domestic level. So this presentation will focus on a few parts of the UN which focus on human rights, and the reason being is that these fora, in those fora is where the Declaration was first drafted, where it was negotiated and finally adopted. It is in these fora where Indigenous peoples' rights continue to be addressed and where Indigenous peoples have been able to make significant developments or achieve significant developments. So this is just an overview of my presentation. Put my glasses on so I can see it. So I'm just going to touch a little on some of the content of the Declaration. I'm then going to briefly look at three specific avenues within the UN system which Indigenous peoples regularly use and which Claire has touched upon. That is the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I then want to just also look a little bit at some of the treaty monitoring bodies and how they have addressed and recognised the Declaration. And lastly, I just want to look at two developments that came out of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, which was held in 2014, that relate to matters that have taken place in the international arena. The main point of my presentation today is to hopefully demonstrate that the UN system itself has and continues to respond to the Declaration. The response is not uniform, given that the UN itself is very large and has a lot of different mandates within it, but it does show that positive change is possible in relation to Indigenous peoples' rights. Sometimes it is excruciatingly slow, but it does and continues to occur. I also wish to acknowledge that none of the developments, in my view, that take place within the UN fora on Indigenous peoples' rights do so unless Indigenous peoples advocate for such changes. And that's why I've put this slide up, which the chair of this panel is probably surprised. But this was Kawan participating in the lead up to the World Conference on Indigenous peoples' rights, along with Catalin, who's from Tonga. So I just wanted to demonstrate that unless Indigenous peoples are active and choose to prioritise this kind of work, then these kinds of developments do not take place. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Just one further one. This is a picture of a Pacific Caucus meeting, which took place in Alta in Norway, and also in the lead up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Again, just demonstrating the importance of collective decision making that takes place by Indigenous peoples in these fora. And when collective decisions are taken by Indigenous peoples, they can influence the outcomes and the decisions that states take. In terms of the content of the Declaration, if you have had a chance to read the Declaration, and I hope you have, you'll notice that many of the rights in the Declaration are focused at the domestic level. However, the Declaration, in both specific and general ways, also pertains to the international sphere. For example, if we look at Articles 3 and 18, which relate to self-determination and participation in decision-making respectively, when they're given a broad and generous interpretation, they relate not only to matters in relation to the domestic context, but also they fall within the ambit of international concern. Therefore, both Articles 3 and 18 can and do apply to how the UN system itself addresses and recognises Indigenous peoples' rights, particularly within those UN fora that specifically address Indigenous peoples' rights. In addition, there are some specific articles that are directly related to the UN system, for example, Articles 41 and 42, which provide for the Declaration to be implemented by way of financial and technical support, as well as the promotion and application of the Declaration in their work. As such, there is plenty of scope for the UN system and UN fora to provide for the Declaration in their relevant mandates and practices. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues encompasses 6 areas, which are 1, economic and social development, 2, culture, 3, environment, 4, education, 5, health, and 6, human rights. So it has a much wider, broad mandate than just human rights. And the mandate of the Permanent Forum, amongst other things, is responsible for mainstreaming Indigenous peoples' rights within the UN system itself. The Permanent Forum consists of 16 independent experts, 8 of whom are nominated by states and 8 who are nominated by Indigenous peoples. The Permanent Forum meets annually for 2 weeks in New York and is the largest gathering of Indigenous peoples at the UN. So the Permanent Forum was established before the adoption of the Declaration in 2002. So when the Declaration was finally adopted, the Permanent Forum immediately embraced the Declaration, and they did this in 2 different ways. First, they began to recommend to UN agencies and states that they review their current policies and practices in light of the Declaration. And second, they included the Declaration in their own working methods and their own practices. So in the first report of the Permanent Forum that was adopted after the Declaration was adopted, the Permanent Forum made a number of recommendations which were directed towards both states and the UN. For example, it recommended that the Declaration be the framework for development plans and all processes related to climate change. And it also honed in on our region by making a specific recommendation that all Pacific states endorse and implement the Declaration. Not only did the Permanent Forum frame its recommendations to the UN system and states by referencing the Declaration, it also considered how the Declaration should affect its own practices. So in the same report of 2008, the Permanent Forum committed to making the Declaration a living document through its work and affirmed the Declaration as its legal framework. The Permanent Forum has continued to use the Declaration to guide its work. It has chosen to consistently apply the Declaration in all areas of its mandate, and it provides a space for Indigenous peoples to address the Declaration during its annual sessions. For example, in the most recent session of the Permanent Forum, there was a specific agenda item to consider the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the report noted the lack of implementation of the Declaration in its 6 mandated areas. So this is a picture of the current Special Rapporteur, Vicky Toli-Korpis. So I'm going to touch upon her and also the previous Special Rapporteur, James Anaya. So the position of the Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples was established in 2001, again prior to the adoption of the Declaration. The Special Rapporteur is a person and they act as an independent expert. They're mandated to receive communications about human rights violations of Indigenous peoples and to provide recommendations and proposals to prevent and remedy such violations. The position of the Special Rapporteur is mandated by a Human Rights Council resolution every 3 years. So when the Declaration was adopted, the Human Rights Council amended the mandate of the Special Rapporteur to include a specific responsibility to promote the Declaration and international instruments relevant to the advancement of the rights of Indigenous peoples. So at that time, this person, Sir James Anaya, he responded to the new mandate by highlighting the importance of promoting and facilitating dialogue with governments and Indigenous peoples to find ways to fully recognise Indigenous peoples' rights. And more specifically, the Special Rapporteur sought to contribute to a better understanding of the legal, political, economic and institutional implications of the international recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights through his annual and country-specific reports. And many of you in the audience may have been present when the Special Rapporteur came to New Zealand on 2 occasions and issued country reports on Aotearoa. So through his reports, the Special Rapporteur addressed a number of issues and again referenced the Declaration and held up those, used the standards in the Declaration to look at these issues. For example, he issued reports on the impacts of development projects on Indigenous communities, the implementation of national laws and international standards to protect Indigenous people's rights. And he also looked at Indigenous participation in policy and decision-making processes. So the current Special Rapporteur, Vicky Toli-Korpis, has also followed similar practices, and last year she released a report on Indigenous people's rights and international investment agreements, and she specifically considered the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is another body within the UN, the third one which I want to touch upon, called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this slide shows the previous commissioner, the Indigenous Commissioner, who was mentioned by David Rutherford this morning. This is Karen Johansson, and with her is Pareri Hathaway, who is also here. And they have attended a number of sessions of the Expert Mechanism on behalf of the Human Rights Commission. So the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was established in 2007. It originally comprised of 5 independent experts. It meets in Geneva for 1 week on an annual basis. Its original mandate was to provide thematic advice to its parent body, the Human Rights Council. And under that mandate, the Expert Mechanism produced a number of thematic reports on matters such as access to justice, language and culture, and participation in decision-making. The reports consider the rights affirmed in the Declaration, drawing upon country-specific examples, as well as elaborating upon what the content of the right or set of rights entails. But also in its first report, the Expert Mechanism adopted the Declaration as its normative framework by which it would carry out its mandate. That meant that the thematic reports I mentioned directly reference and engage with the Declaration. Further, the process by which those research reports were written was very inclusive. For example, the expert mechanism called for written submissions from both states and Indigenous peoples. It tabled a draft report at its annual session and held an agenda item so that people could respond and provide critique and comment on that draft, which was then incorporated into the final report. In my view, this is a good example of how the standards in the Declaration which relate to participation in decision-making are realised in the work of the expert mechanism. Last year, the mandate of the expert mechanism was strengthened, and I will elaborate upon that later in this presentation. I now wish to touch upon treaty monitoring bodies. This slide is the meeting room in Palais Wilson in Geneva, where the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination meets. So this is where states have to come and present their reports and answer the questions that the experts put to them. And it's also an opportunity for national human rights institutions like the Human Rights Commission to also formally address the body. There is no formal standing for non-state participants, but the experts are very happy to meet informally with non-state participants. So there are also opportunities for non-governmental organisations, Māori organisations and other kinds of organisations to engage with the experts. So the Declaration has also influenced the work of treaty monitoring bodies. UN human rights treaties do not specifically reference Indigenous people's rights. However, the committees that are attached to these treaties have seen fit to interpret such treaties in accordance with Indigenous people's rights. The right of self-determination, which has already been discussed this morning, is found in Common Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So the UN Human Rights Committee, which monitors compliance with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, first addressed self-determination in 1999 when they were considering Canada. The committee noted that the right of self-determination protects Indigenous peoples in their enjoyment of rights over traditional lands, and it recommended that the practice of extinguishing inherent Aboriginal rights be abandoned as incompatible with Article 1 of the Covenant. The committee regularly examines New Zealand's compliance with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as well. In its most recent report of 2016, a number of recommendations were made in relation to Māori rights. And specifically, the committee recommended that New Zealand should strengthen the role of the Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand's constitutional arrangements, and that it should guarantee the informed participation of Māori in all consultation processes, both national and international, that directly affect Māori. The Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination monitors compliance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Like the Committee on Human Rights, it also regularly examines New Zealand's compliance with this convention. And last month, as has been noted by previous speakers, the committee released its report on New Zealand and made a number of recommendations in relation to Māori rights. And specifically, it recommended that New Zealand recognise the fundamental right of self-determination of Māori and the obligation to establish shared governance with Hapu, and that New Zealand respect Māori committees' collective rights to freshwater and geothermal resources. In 2014, the UN held a special session of the General Assembly called the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. And this is Mika. He was one of the participants. He's from Tuvalu. That conference adopted an outcome document which contains a number of commitments that states made in relation to the implementation of the Declaration. And there are just two specific ones that I want to mention in relation to the international space. So first, states committed to reviewing the mandate of the expert mechanism in order to monitor, evaluate and improve the achievement of the Declaration. As you would have noticed previously, the Permanent Forum has a really strong focus on what's happening within the UN space and trying to make changes there, and the Special Rapporteur can respond to specific individual communications. But what has been lacking in the UN system is the ability for Indigenous peoples to bring issues relating to country-specific matters and to have some discussion and elaboration as to how to resolve some of those issues. So with the new mandate of the expert mechanism, it can now prepare an annual study on the status of Indigenous peoples' rights worldwide by focusing on specific articles of the Declaration. It can now provide technical advice regarding the development of domestic legislation and policies related to Indigenous peoples' rights. It can also facilitate dialogue between states, Indigenous peoples and or the private sector, and it can seek and receive information from all relevant sources as necessary to fulfil its mandate. So the idea being that hopefully with the strengthened mandate we can have a much more country-specific focus and hold governments to account for how they are often not applying or implementing the Declaration. The second commitment to come out of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that I wish to highlight is the strengthening of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions in UN fora. Currently, the UN is unable to accommodate Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, requiring them to participate in the UN either as non-governmental organisations or to become part of a state delegation. Despite the appointment of 2 Indigenous advisors, one of which is seated here on the podium, as well as a series of inclusive and open meetings whereby Indigenous peoples and states could input into the respective draft versions of the final resolution, the outcome has been less than satisfactory, with some conservative states unwilling to recognise Indigenous peoples' rights by finding new ways to ensure appropriate accreditation and access to the UN. As a result, the process has been postponed for 3 years, by which time the Secretary-General is to report to the General Assembly on possible measures to provide for the participation of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions in UN fora affecting them. Further consideration will then be given as to how the participation of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions can be enhanced. And there will be a series of informal interactive hearings over the next 3 years, which will take place during the sessions of the Permanent Forum, so that Indigenous peoples can provide input into the Secretary-General's report. In some ways, all of that work has already been done in the previous process, hence the reason why it's quite frustrating and disappointing for Indigenous peoples that we have not been able to push this commitment so that it becomes a reality. But it may take a longer conversation and some very strategic lobbying of some of those states who are very conservative in their views as to how Indigenous peoples' representative institutions should be recognised within the UN system. So in summary, I trust this brief overview has demonstrated how the UN has responded to and interacted with the Declaration. For those UN fora that focus on Indigenous peoples' rights, the Declaration has had an immediate impact on their work, both substantively and in terms of their own practice. Such developments are to be welcomed, though there is still much work to be done. What this review does show, however, is that the UN, with its numerous state members, its 7 official languages, and its complex and at times frustrating hierarchy and structure, has sought to implement and recognise Indigenous peoples' rights in ways that are effective and meaningful to Indigenous peoples. So it raises the argument, if an organisation such as the UN is capable of such change, then clearly states such as New Zealand, who are active in UN fora and speak to Indigenous people's rights, are also capable of bringing about change at the domestic level. Kia ora mai rā.